Exploring North Carolina believes there is genius in our system of state and national parks. Each is different and tells a different story. Nowhere is this genius better illustrated than in North Carolina's two long parks. Cape Lookout National Seashore, where there are no roads, and a park where a road is the centerpiece, the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is ironic that a park with no road and a park with a road as its centerpiece have both had the effect of preserving and displaying some of the best wilderness left in eastern America today. Both are managed by the National Park Service, which celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2016. This is one of North Carolina's wild places, Cape Lookout National Seashore. It stretches 50 miles to the north. I first visited Cape Lookout in the 1960s. It was wild then, and it's just as wild now. This is one of North Carolina's long parks. For many legislators in North Carolina, it seems strange to protect an undeveloped ribbon of sand known as Core Banks, stretching from Portsmouth Island to Cape Point. But they appropriated $7 million in the early 1970s to purchase it. One North Carolina legislator put it this way: "I don't know why we're buying land that won't even grow tobacco." For the state of North Carolina and the National Park Service, it was money well spent. The most iconic landmark in the National Seashore is the magnificent diamond-painted lighthouse, built between 1857 and 1859. It is 163 feet tall and can be seen for almost 20 miles. To understand some of Core Banks' early history and just how unique it is, I went to Stan Riggs, who knows North Carolina's barrier islands and their ecosystems as well as anyone.
Core Banks is a system that's been allowed to breathe and live with those ocean dynamics. It is as natural a barrier island system as we still have left in the United States today and in the world. And it's an incredibly dynamic system that has evolved dramatically in the last 50 years of its history, but it hasn't always been what it is today. There's a history here that's really important. There's a Native American history on the Outer Banks of the Cape Lookout, particularly on Shackleford Banks. There's Native American middens that date back to 2,500 years ago. And then through time, up until the settlers came in the 1500s. But these were all minor occupations in which there was very little impact on the islands.
I asked Stan Riggs if the land comprising Cape Lookout National Seashore was as wild and untouched when the National Seashore began.
Core Banks hasn't always been the jewel it is right now. There was a period starting in the early 1900s when development pressures were beginning. There were plans for all sorts of industrial development, shipping ports, railroads. World War I, World War II came along, and there was a big presence of military on the Outer Banks. And after World War II, there were squatters, little shacks, beach cottages, and thousands of beach buggies, old cars that everybody took out there. In those days, beach buggies were really beach buggies, and they all died out there, so we had cars everywhere. Today, they're the healthiest barrier islands we have. This is not only a natural laboratory to understand how this coastal system works, it's become an incredibly rich habitat on the backside in core sounds with all the marshes and the shallow aquatic vegetation that grows in those shallow flats behind the barrier islands. This is the last of North Carolina's jewels in the crown. It is From a National Park Service, in my opinion, it is the crown jewel of national seashores, without a question. It is a resource that's healthy, it's living, it's breathing, it's doing what seashores and estuaries need to do to survive in a storm-dominated system with rising sea level.
Exploring North Carolina has worked with Dr. Sue Stuska for many years. Sue is the biologist for this wild national seashore and knows its seasons, ecosystems, and diverse creatures.
So what makes Cape Lookout so special is that although other parks preserve barrier islands, you can drive to those. And here, there are no roads and no bridges. So when you get there, you've had to work a little harder. And that takes away all of the amenities that you might get when you bring your automobile. Basically, this is nature at its finest, almost entirely untouched. If you can only come here once, by all means come and enjoy your experience to the utmost. But if you can come more than once, come in different seasons, come in different tidal ranges, come when the tide is high, when the tide is low, when the birds are migrating through, and just experience all of the different seasons. In order to be able to appreciate it, it's nice to see how it changes from time to time. Each of the seasons has its own special beauty. In the summer, of course, everything is green and lush. That continues into the fall, but then you get some of the beautiful fall colors. In the winter, things go brown, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. And then in the spring again, you get the first little glimmers of green that start just on the edges of the branches and just on the edges of the marshes and spreads.
It has been said that America's most productive farmlands are its salt marshes. Sue Stuska explains.
There's a ripple effect in the marsh so that the tiniest creatures, as they grow, they become food for the next biggest creatures, who become food for the next biggest creatures. So that web of life with the plants and the smallest animals gradually nourishes bigger and bigger until we get the bigger fish, the bigger shellfish, and then the birds ingest that, and there's a whole ripple effect so that the largest creatures that we actually consider as ocean creatures have their start in the smallest creatures that grow up in the marshes.
So how do you get to this place with no roads? You can take a ferry from Harker's Island or Beaufort, or take your own boat. Those of us who frequent Cape Lookout are the beneficiaries of this rich food web. Visitors, birders, and hunters are treated to an incredible variety of birds from the northern and southern hemisphere. Sports fishermen and commercial fishermen reap the benefits of Cape Lookout's pristine waters. Even with all of the extraordinary marine life and avian life at Cape Lookout, one group of animals has become a symbol of Cape Lookout National Seashore: the wild horses. Sue Stuska told us how these introduced animals have adapted to life on Shackleford banks, even during hurricanes.
On the 9-mile-long Shackleford banks, we are keeping about 120 to 130 horses. That's a rather narrow range for animals that live possibly into their 30s. And the Shackleford horses really take care of themselves quite well in storms. They have gone into the thickest part of the maritime forest, or the thickest shrub thickets, and they have hunkered down or been on high ground, depending on how high the water's rising, and stayed there, either dozing or grazing, and then they emerge and go on about their daily patterns as if nothing has happened. What you see today when you see Shackleford horses is a breed of horse that has adapted to uniquely live in this ecosystem where any of the breeds that we have so carefully cultivated today would probably be unlikely to make a living. These horses have adapted to eat grasses with a very high salt content, especially on the outer portions of the grass. They've adapted to being able to drink infrequently, although they drink only fresh water. They have managed to live perfectly well and reproduce wonderfully given a relatively harsh environment with a relatively low plane of nutrition.
Both Sue Stuska and Stan Riggs have told us why this wild, long park is important for all of us, even if we never visit it.
Because the barrier islands of Cape Lookout National Seashore are allowed to change with nature, with the seas, with the tides, with the storms, they are a stark contrast to those barrier islands that are influenced by man. So it's very instructive to observe those islands that we live on, that we've affected, and then come to Cape Lookout National Seashore and see what it looks like when it is allowed to change naturally. Sometimes the change is very, very rapid. It can happen within one storm, and other times it takes a number of years.
Well, the most important thing we can learn is that we'll always have a beach on Core Banks, always. We will not always have a beach on the islands where we put sandbag walls, where we have rock walls, where we have to rebuild artificial beaches by renourishing and pumping sand. Sea level is rising, the islands are moving. If we put walls of structures and houses and highways, we're drawing absolute lines in the sand, and the response is that we lose our beach. That will never happen on Core Banks. It will always have a sandy beach, a beautiful beach, forever. It just won't be in the same place.
Now we want to take you to North Carolina's other long park, an equally wild and wonderful place. Most people have a hard time believing there is a park in eastern America, 469 miles long, 250 miles of which is in North Carolina. This is a park with thousands of species of plants, hundreds of birds, and big game animals. You can drive through this park and never see a stoplight or a stop sign. I'm talking about one of America's greatest roads, the Blue Ridge Parkway. Having spent much of my early life in western North Carolina, the Blue Ridge Parkway was two things: a destination and a portal to many other destinations. From the Parkway, you can easily reach North Carolina's Stone Mountain State Park, Grandfather Mountain State Park, or Mount Mitchell State Park. From the Parkway, you can also see unbroken vistas at places like Devil's Courthouse, Looking Glass Mountain, Water Rock Knob, and Graveyard Fields. Exploring North Carolina was privileged to meet with the superintendent of the Blue Ridge Parkway, Mark Woods, and with Jack Betts, retired associate editor of the Charlotte Observer and now the chairman of the Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation. Like Cape Lookout National Seashore, the Blue Ridge Parkway was not always the wild, beautiful place it is now. Mark Woods and Jack Betts explain.
The landscape today is vastly different than it would have been during the period of construction along the parkway. You know, many of the areas had been clear cut of trees, but through the CCC and the WPA efforts, you know, the parkway literally was transformed. It's a designed landscape.
It's hard to imagine now, but more than a century ago, in the early years of the 20th century, much of this region was heavily logged over by timber interests. And what we see now is a gorgeous natural landscape was not natural at all. Much of it was rough looking. The forest had been denuded, not much cleanup had been done. There were a lot of stumps. Some of it could not be timbered. It was so remote and on such steep slopes that it was impossible to get them out. So North Carolina was lucky in some respects because there were pockets of virgin forest that survived that early timbering effort. So the planners who picked the route and how it would look and where people could stop and pull their cars over and look out, you know, that did not look anything like what it looked like in the 40s and 50s when it was under construction, and nowhere like the rich and lush forest that we see this narrow road snaking through today. It is just dramatically different from what you would have seen had you hiked these hills in the 1930s when they were laying out the parkway.
Exploring North Carolina wanted to know about the landscape design and about the minute details that went into building the parkway.
One thing that really made the Blue Ridge Parkway marvelous was that during this period, the Great Depression was upon us. There were so many landscape architects who were out of work, and the parkway was able to summon a great number of very talented landscape architects and other specialists who would help the parkway planners decide how to route the road, what plantings could be used. There's probably a myth that the parkway was just laid across the top of the ridges, and it wasn't exactly that. There was a lot of thoughtful planning about how they wanted things to look.
So you had incredible and monumental construction efforts taking place, building bridges, building tunnels, building incredible stone retaining walls that are beautiful today and attract visitors from all over the world. And you had many areas that were replanted, you know, with rhododendron and native plants to provide that designed landscape that the landscape architects sought to achieve along the Blue Ridge Parkway.
During the planning process, researchers would go from place to place along the Blue Ridge where there were stone walls or stone chimneys and make sketches of how they were done and count the rocks, the stones, how they were laid and in what patterns, if there was a discernible pattern. And those were reused in the bridges and other built trails and markers along the parkway.
Even the newest parts of the parkway, finished in the 1980s, offer examples of extraordinary engineering and a desire to protect the land.
The construction of the viaduct, which was the last section of the parkway to open in 1987, was done in a way so that the structure was literally kind of laid lightly on the landscape, and you literally travel among boulders and trees and vegetation, and it's a marvelous engineering feat, and visitors from all over the world still come to study that.
For many visitors, one of the grand secrets to the parkway's success is in its biodiversity.
You can go from just over 600 feet at the James River up in Virginia, which is very different than the area we're in now, to areas that are over 6,000 feet on the southern terminus of the parkway, and then everything in between the north end and the south end. The diversity changes with the change in elevation. Every 1,000 feet you're in a different area with incredible diversity. The diversity here would equal or surpass what you would find in all of Europe. Tremendous variety of wildlife. I was up on the parkway 2 weeks ago, saw a beautiful black bear as I was leaving the Pisgah Inn, just off on the side of the road that evening. I've seen elk just within the last few weeks, several elk right along the side of the road. Eagles. I mean, the list goes on and on. It's just every day and every minute is a different experience.
And scientists and botanists and people who care about plant life have been astonished to find that in these larger mountains, not just the Blue Ridge, but the southern Appalachian highlands, there are over 4,000 species of plants and 2,000 species of fungi, for example, 500 species of mosses and lichens in this region. There's just an enormous variety of life in these old hills, and it changes from mile to mile along the parkway, and you just never know what you're going to find.
There are many ways to describe the benefits of the Blue Ridge Parkway. The number of visitors, the amount of money spent, and the benefits to the spirit. I asked Mark Woods and Jack Betts to tell us about the Parkway's benefits to the people of North Carolina, the nation, and to the people of the Blue Ridge Mountains.
It really provides, to me, a university without walls for us to really kind of study what's going on in the world around us. And watersheds are one key element of that up and down the parkway. We just recently, with the help of conservation organizations in North Carolina, added just over 5,000 acres in the Water Rock Knob area of the park, protecting watersheds for the communities of Waynesville and Silva. The parkway bounced up to the most visited unit in the entire national park system last year. And this year we're seeing visitation continue to increase. We had just over 15 million visitors last year to the parkway alone. The economic impact to the communities around the parkway is over $950 million.
You literally will see, depending on the time of year, you will drive from winter to spring to summer and to fall. Again, if you spend enough time on the parkway, you will also see this in a day's time. You can go from 60s and 70s in some parts and drive up into a blowing snowstorm or a sleet storm. You will see trees in certain parts of the parkway in October where the trees are just a rich, glorious green, and you'll drive 2 miles and you'll see the most spectacular reds and oranges and yellows that you've seen, and you just marvel that this can be done. It's balm to the soul. Someone once described it, if you drive on the parkway for an hour or so, you feel like you have had a glimpse of God.
The Blue Ridge Parkway is a paved road down the middle of one of the most beautiful landscapes in America. Here, a bit of paradise was paved, but it wasn't turned into a parking lot. We like to think of the parkway as a paved portal to wild places and things.
Whether you're a beach person or a mountain person, you'll find the best of each in North Carolina's long parks, Cape Lookout National Seashore, and the Blue Ridge Parkway. And we learned this while exploring North Carolina.